recording? Awesome. So, hello everyone. It is a beautiful fall day in Cleveland, Ohio, Northeast Ohio, where we are. I am Coach Joe. This is Susan Eileen. This is the second episode of the podcast series that Susan's going to be talking about. It's going to be available on her TikTok shop, which she can talk more about, which is really pretty exciting. This is all about how to occupy yourself in early sobriety. What I want to do first is start with a little high-level, simple brain chemical discussion, and that's dopamine. Dopamine's a neurotransmitter that is commonly referred to as the feel-good hormone. When you're in addiction or have addictive behaviors, whether it's substances or activities, that raises the dopamine level in your head. And what happens with that is it sets off that initial excitement, that initial elation that you feel. The challenge and the problem with addictive behavior is that reduces the number of neurotransmitters that are sending the dopamine around in your brain, which means you have to do more of that behavior to increase those dopamine levels to where you were before. That's the devil in the addiction. Now, there are ways to fix that, and that is by replacing how you get that dopamine. And that's what we're here to talk about today, is that early sobriety and how you still maintain those dopamine levels. You're just getting them from a different source. So a couple of things about those are just basic taking care of yourself better. And I'm going to toss it over to Susan to talk about this because she has some really good experience with finding replacements for getting that dopamine level up.
So you do need to be very cautious when you are looking for replacement dopamine because you want it to be healthy, natural dopamine. Obviously, in active addiction, and for the premises or the purposes of this podcast, we'll just say it was, prescriptions or alcohol. But gambling and shopping or, promiscuous sex actually leads to all of the same fake, unsustainable dopamine that you were used to getting. So you need to avoid fake, unsustainable dopamine. It could be really easy in early sobriety away from alcohol to get mixed up in either, physical intimacy, shopping, or gambling, and replace your addiction altogether, and then you're never going to deal with the root of the issue. So in early sobriety, first, it is going to be tough. There's no way around it. You have delayed the 5 stages of grief on a lot of things for a long time. So, but what you didn't realize, or maybe you did, is that when you dull the bad feelings in active addiction, you're also dulling the good feelings too, which is why by the time you decide to quit, you realize you're never happy anymore because you're killing any of the joy in your life. You were trying to kill the bad times, but you accidentally killed the joy instead. So you want to focus on bringing that joy back into your life, because that's the only way you're really going to want to stay sober, is if it feels better than actively using. So in early sobriety, you really need to treat yourself like a 4-year-old child. Put yourself to bed at 10 o'clock at night. Keep the cell phone away from you. Really focus on good nutrition. If you do pick up a new hobby, don't go overboard on it. People with ADHD, and there are a lot of people with drinking problems that have undiagnosed ADHD, but ADHDers, when they find a new hobby, will also buy 3 years worth of supplies and then abandon the hobby 1 month in. So don't go too overboard with buying anything. I mean, for myself, I was at rock bottom, so I didn't even have the money to invest in a hobby like that. But it's also important not to take on too much. So, another tendency of people who are addicts is they tend to be people pleasers. They tend to spread themselves too thin and overcommit. And that's also another way to sabotage your sobriety, because in the stress of people pleasing and overcommitting, you've left no time for yourself and are going to want to turn to a drink. And that's probably something you've been doing for years and didn't even realize it.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is so much in what Susan just said to unpack. So first, ADHD. So full disclosure, I have ADHD. Susan has ADHD. About 25 to 30% of those with ADHD have addictive behavior. So if you think you might have ADHD, get yourself tested and confirm that, because you can treat ADHD two ways, medically and behaviorally. I do it both ways. I do have medication. I do deal with different ways of changing my habits. Now, the other thing that Susan just talked about too was what's called transfer addiction. So I know from the time Susan and I started working together, she has done so well with the abstinence from alcohol, but it turned into a shopping addiction.
For a brief period of time, briefly, I was replacing alcohol with shopping. And now I could literally go 2 years without buying a single thing. Because remember that ADHD tendency to buy too much, I did the same thing. And instead of buying 4 pairs of leggings, bought 40 pairs of leggings. So
yeah, full disclosure, I'm not trying to throw Susan under the bus, but she could have opened up her own legging store.
Now, the other interesting thing that we're finding is that people with ADHD, about 85% of them actually have undiagnosed autism. So for myself, I actually had undiagnosed ADHD and undiagnosed autism. Plus, while I was in active addiction, I was in a narcissistically abusive relationship. And the reason why all of that is important is because those 3 things mixing together made me seem very much more bipolar than I actually am, because the highs and lows of narcissistic abuse can look similar to being bipolar. And it's really important to get that accurate diagnosis, because realistically, a bad diagnosis is almost as bad as not going to the doctor at all. Because if you're getting the wrong medication or the wrong coping mechanisms, it was almost pointless even to try it out, except to rule out that wasn't the problem. Now, I have ADHD, but I have to work on behavioral modifications, because obviously being in recovery, I at some point in time lost the ability to read directions on a prescription container properly. So if I got ADHD medication, I'd probably take the whole month's worth in 3 days. So I have to work on it behaviorally. And that's when I talk about lifestyle adjustments. So for instance, suppose you notice that you get really overstimulated really easily while you're in the city. Well, that's actually, once you notice that about yourself, you've actually done yourself a big favor by then. Now you know, if you get overstimulated easily around traffic and bright lights, then obviously living in the city isn't a good idea. Maybe living in the country is a better idea. But you start exploring those types of lifestyle adjustments because you begin to realize just how much the community you're living in is actually impacting you.
Yeah, absolutely. That is so important. And the reason why we're recording in the park is because early in Susan's sobriety, when we went through a self-awareness, she had a high level of appreciation of beauty. And one of the early things that Susan did that really helped her sobriety was hiking. So we're in a national park here in Northeast Ohio. And tell us a little bit more about the group of individuals that you found with that common interest.
Well, real quick, I would like to say that the hiking, with the undiagnosed ADHD, obviously I had known on some level that I was too hyper because my drugs of choice were all things that calmed me down. I never liked the drugs that pepped you up. I liked the drugs that were downers, I guess, as they would call them.
Yeah.
So that should have been an indication to me that I had a hyperactivity problem. And don't let anybody tell you that ADHD is not a full-blown disability, because it is. So with my newfound energy, because now I wasn't self-medicating myself into a coma, I decided to come to the park. I got sober during the government, or the shutdown that happened during the pandemic. So there wasn't even a whole lot of places to go. Thankfully, I live in a part of the area where there is a very extensive park system, and I started reconnecting with friends who were healthier for me, friends that weren't nearly as dysfunctional as the people I was drinking with. And so then that led to me doing several vacations with the Explorer Chicks. So I ended up going to West Virginia. I did a winter vacation in West Virginia. I hiked the Canyonlands in Utah, and I went to the Smoky Mountains. And it was actually in the Smoky Mountains where I noticed how overstimulated I got in shopping areas, because once I noticed I was participating in transfer addiction, I cut up all my credit cards, and I'm so used to not shopping that once I was in Gatlinburg, which felt like Myrtle Beach in the middle of the mountains, and it was so overstimulating because I just not even used to the consumerism anymore.
Yeah. So I want to touch on one thing that Susan just said with cutting up the credit cards. So something that can't be coached is commitment. So once you make that decision and make that commitment to trying to achieve the life that you deserve, then you have to dig your heels in and make that choice to cut those credit cards up. If I tell you to cut your credit cards up, or Susan tells you to cut your credit cards up, or whatever your medical provider is that's treating you, unless you're committed to it, you're not going to do it. So that was a huge step to say, okay, here's my line in the sand, I'm done, and here go the credit cards.
Yes, and Joe brings up a good point, because the only person that can change your life is you, and we will probably talk about this in another podcast, but people might get into relationships where one person is the fixer or the saver or the rescuer, and typically those relationships don't even work, because what if you're trying to rescue a person that doesn't even want to be rescued? It's going to be a brutal relationship.
Yeah. One thing we love about this is that we have kind of an idea what we want to talk about. We have the subject, and we have some bullet points, but the conversation goes where it goes between the two of us. So it's a lot of fun. I want to point out one thing that Susan is so gifted at, and that is her love of quilting. And
yes,
talk about that a little bit.
So I started quilting as a mindfulness activity. So again, going with the extreme amount of self-awareness I've gained about myself, and I think you'll be surprised when you get sober. You will be surprised at how little you actually know about yourself, why you do the things that you do, why you have the quirks that you have. I think you'll be shocked. You're almost a stranger to yourself. But I grew up with 3 brothers, and even though I was in a decently sized family, I still have some only child syndrome tendencies, because I was the only girl in the house. So I spent a lot of time alone. So growing up, I ended up doing reading, I did painting, I did hook-a-rug activities. Those were huge in the 80s. Yeah. But on TikTok, everybody's been talking about healing their inner child. And I feel like I accidentally healed my inner child by going back to all the stuff that I loved as a kid. Yeah. But the quilting has just been incredible, because you are going to be surprised at how long a 24-hour day seems in early sobriety. You are going to think to yourself, like, where did all these hours come from? Like, I had no idea a day was this long. So you're going to have to fill your time with something. Now, quilting is an expensive hobby. I couldn't really get into it till like year 3, but it brings out all of the creativity. It brings out my craftiness, and then you're getting a quilt that is going to last forever. And when I give the quilts to people, or I've also made some for nonprofit places to auction off at charities, it's an heirloom that will last forever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, Susan has brought up mindfulness a couple of times, and as she does that, it reminds me back to our early relationship as client coach, but now we're working together. But the thing that mindfulness reminds me of is something that Susan said really early on, and that was, you have to get used to feeling again, because you're not masking it, and it can be uncomfortable, and you have to work through that, especially in early sobriety.
And this year, I don't feel like I really achieved emotional sobriety till this year, which was my 3rd year. Up to that point, you may go on a pink cloud where you're just happy a lot, and that's very common. You could be experiencing symptoms of what they call being a dry drunk, and even though you're sober, you're still stuffing your feelings, and I was guilty of that as well. And when you feel those big feelings again, it is going to be tough. And but you've got to realize that you are going to have to feel those feelings sometime. It's sort of like a bear, wanting to get through the woods. There is no other way for the bear to get through the woods other than through the woods. There is no other way to become a healthy, functioning person than to feel your feelings fully, both good and both bad. So I had alluded to, you probably drank through the 5 stages of grief on a lot of things. I know while I was drinking, my mom passed away, my dad passed away, I moved, I quit a job, I went through a divorce, I empty nested. That's like 7 super stressful things that I never actually properly grieved. So this past year has actually been a very emotionally difficult one, but realistically, I was going from age 10 to age 30 in the span of 1 year.
Yeah.
So, and that's why it was so emotionally rough. But look, I lived. I mean, your emotions are not going to kill you. And if they get so intense that you consider something drastic like that, obviously you would need to contact 911.
Absolutely.
But that is why a medicated detox is the most beneficial. You are definitely, and that's why I do this Breaking the Chains program, because it's holistic. It involves my psychiatric medications, my therapy, Coach Joe, my gut health, my physical health, my hobbies, my job. It's like a whole life approach instead of just attacking the drinking problem.
Yeah, it doesn't happen in silos. You've got to have everything. And when we talk about the coaching that we do, it is forward looking. So
Yes.
The medical help is important, because it helps you, therapy, psychiatry, medications, etc., helps you figure out how you got where you are. And then the coaching end of it helps you go from, okay, now that you know where you are and why you got here, let's figure out how to get you forward. And that's where a lot of that self-awareness comes in that we keep talking about. A lot of this is how you're relating to yourself and how you're relating to those around you. So, and we're going to get into some of that stuff too.
And realistically, what you're doing in early sobriety is building a relationship with yourself. Obviously, you don't have a good relationship with yourself in active addiction.
Right.
Because you are, physically destroying your body on a daily basis. So, and you need to have a good relationship with yourself realistically before you can have good relationships with other people.
Wow.
Loving yourself, having a healthy relationship for yourself, to me, is the foundation of having a healthy relationship with other people.
That was just powerful with what Susan just said. And I think maybe with that kind of wraps up this episode.
Yes.
So what you want to do is make sure you check out, or obviously you already are following Susan at Sober Queen of Hearts on TikTok. But if this resonates with someone you know, encourage them to start following Susan on Sober Queen of Hearts.
Yes.
So, you'll see more of these episodes. We love doing these.
Yes.
We love kind of sharing what works and what doesn't, and we want to connect with you. The program Susan alluded to, it's called Breaking the Chains, and it goes through the self-awareness, how you're relating, and then the commitment comes in with either a 6-month or a 1-year coaching commitment from you. Because what happens is when you learn all this stuff about yourself, there is a forgetting curve. And if you don't reinforce it, most things that you learn actually fall off after the first 7 days of learning it. So part of that commitment with the coaching is how internalizing it and how to apply what you've learned to keep building that momentum.
Yes, which is Bloom's taxonomy. So
there you go.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And remember, don't overcommit in early sobriety. Stick to just a few things. Baby steps.
Baby steps, yes.
So, All right. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Take care.